Well, everyone, welcome back to the Regeneration Podcast. I'm Michael Martin with my co-host, Mike Sauter. How's it going, Mike?
Good. We know it's cold where you are. It's very cold where I am, about 4 degrees Fahrenheit, but thankfully very little wind. But this is winter in upstate New York. And our guest this morning, I just heard, and we'll have to see if your siblings grew up there, but our guest this morning grew up or spent a few years about 2 miles from my home of 30 years or so, and about 50 yards from where my wife grew up.
Yeah, that's insane.
So it reminds me, our guest today is Addison Hodges Hart, retired priest, right? We're a retired Episcopal priest, am I correct, or Anglican?
That's correct. Episcopal.
That's right. And author of many fine books, and is the most recent one The Silent Rosary?
It is.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading it. I haven't read it yet, but it looks really good. And he's also, among his other books, my personal favorite, because I have a personal involvement in it, is Confessions of the Antichrist, which I had the pleasure of copy editing not too long ago. It was a lot of fun. And in fact, I recommended that the publisher put it out in the first place. So he sent it back to me to copy it.
Then I owe you a lot of thanks. So,
that's right.
And
Addison is one of those people I encountered on Facebook, and we get along really well because we like the same stuff. So whenever there's a nice link connected to the Green Man or the seasonal festivals, Addison will always tag me in it or send it to me. And there's a lot of this. And we also have a deep love for English mysticism. And I'm gonna brag right now. And you had a recent I have to also say Addison's got a wonderful Substack that I subscribe to called The Pragmatic Mystic. And he writes a lot about mysticism. And speaking of mysticism, here's the classic text right here.
I've got my copy somewhere. I didn't know we were talking about it today, but yeah, a win.
So I bought this one. I think it was Screw Books, some Watkins Books, some used bookstore in London on Museum Street in 1989. It's a first edition.
Oh, really?
One of my prized possessions.
Yeah.
I've given copies away, then I pick them up again. This one was right behind me, her essentials of mysticism, but obviously it's not the classic we're all referencing here.
That's one of her. Actually, the two classics that most people reference is, of course, Mysticism. That's just when I stumbled across that in my university library in something like 1978, I felt like I had found a treasure trove. It was just a remarkable discovery. Nobody put me onto it. I just found it there on the shelf. But the other one, of course, is her practical mysticism. And when I named my Substack The Pragmatic Mystic, I had that in the back of my mind, of course.
That's
practical mysticism.
So let's start there. I mean, how did you find your way into this life you've lived of being a priest and being interested in mysticism and in folk religion as well, I would say, right?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how did that happen? How'd that occur?
Wow, that's a big question. I of course I all the way back in the 70s I came into a deeper Christian commitment. I'd grown up an Episcopalian, and actually through the charismatic movement. I wouldn't describe myself as a charismatic today, but about 50 years ago I was, though. And that rejuvenated or ignited, I should say, my faith to a great extent. So I don't look back at it in a entirely negative way or anything. It opened for me a lot of doors of thought and prayer and all that, which otherwise would never have opened for me. And somewhere along the way, actually what I did, I ended up going to an Assembly of God Bible Institute in upstate New York, Lima, New York.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay.
What's the name of that town, Addison?
Lima, they call it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So you went to the Lima
I'm not sure
Bible.
which they call it.
No,
Yeah,
no, I was on that
no,
campus the other day. You would get a kick out of what it looks like now. A
has
lot
it
of
changed?
anti-Catholic books in their library, like 5 copies of every anti-Catholic book. But it's
Well, I'm not entirely surprised. It was,
yeah,
but during the charismatic movement heyday of the 70s, they were very careful not to alienate the Catholic charismatics. So
Mhm.
we actually went as a student body and visited the local Catholic church and things like that.
very
So
cool.
I guess things have changed some. But I only lasted there a few months. They kicked me out because I refused not to have dealings with my then fiance. So being the rebellious soul that I was, I didn't last 6 months there. So,
It's great.
but I came back. It was an unpleasant time, and I came back, and then I found myself gravitating very strongly back towards the Episcopal Church or towards Anglicanism, and roughly about the same time, um, I I got to be very friendly with the All Saints Sisters of the Poor, an Anglican sisterhood that had an American branch right there in Catonsville, Maryland, which is where I was living. Was Maryland. It's actually where I lived most of my boyhood. And I got to know those sisters very well. And at the same time, I began attending the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and took a history of Christianity course from a Greek Orthodox professor named Aristides Papadakis, whose books I think are still in print. He has a few books in print. He was a historian, mainly the Middle Ages and Byzantine history and Christianity. And somehow those two things dovetailed, and I began to explore the spiritual mystical tradition through the All Saints Sisters of the Poor, because very much geared towards contemplation and contemplative spirituality. And at the same time, I was studying the history of Christianity from a Greek Orthodox professor who was very much involved in his faith. And from there, I went on to discover things like Evelyn Underhill, also the Philokalia, and the 2 volumes that were available back in those days, which were the early fathers of the Philokalia and writings from the Philokalia on the Prayer of the Heart, those 2 volumes that Faber and Faber put out. And read the entire corpus of John of the Cross and things like that. So became more and more drawn into a real appreciation for that. By the time 1982 rolled around, I was asked by the religious studies department. They actually had a religious studies department there that was quite active. This was still back when the universities were actually teaching humanities and
Way back in the day.
Can you remember those days? It was fun. And they asked me to teach a course on the contemplative tradition, so East and West. So I began really doing a lot of research in things like Buddhism and Indian religions and et cetera. And that expanded my knowledge quite a bit in those areas. And actually, one of my students there was a very young David Bentley Hart, my brother, who I like to tell people I taught him everything he knows. But anyway, that's basically how I got launched. And since then, I've had my ups and downs and everything, but I have pretty much kept very steadily an interest in that aspect of faith ever since.
No, so Evelyn Underhill. So my introduction to her, I was probably mid-20s, I'm guessing, early 20s, mid-20s. And what really attracted me to mysticism was her discussion of poets as mystics,
Yeah.
which drew me into the great, 17th century English poets, John Donne, especially Thomas Traherne and Vaughan. George Herbert, whom you wrote about George Herbert recently in your blog,
Yeah.
your Substack, and so I was, really fascinated by these these writers and this idea of poetry as mysticism, or as potential mysticism, or as a site of contemplation. And so when I went to graduate school, I wanted to write my dissertation on early modern religious literature, but mostly poetry. But I felt like I needed to get a grounding in the English mystical tradition. So I forced a medievalist to give me an independent study on English mysticism, medieval mysticism. Now, let me ask you this, because it occurred to me. There seems to me to be something very different about that mystical tradition with Walter Hilton and the Cloud of Unknowing than much of what is called mysticism in other traditions and other parts of Europe at the time. Do you see that too? And what would you say about that?
I'm interested in this. Tell me.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I think there is a very distinctive English mystical tradition, and or almost an English voice, which isn't always being expressed by English persons. For example, Anselm of Canterbury was French, and but was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and yet when you're reading Anselm, you very definitely hear what we would think of as a medieval English mystical voice. There's something about it, and it's very possible, possibly because at that period, French and English were very much on the same wavelength. So you have William of Saint Thierry, for example, the Cistercian, who, although he himself is not English, seems to have had a lot of influence and a lot of readers in England in the 12th century. So you have these figures which have influence in the development of English spirituality, but I think that it's kind of hard to say exactly how I would define that. One of the great writers on this actually was Martin Thornton. Are you familiar with that name?
I'm not.
Thornton. He wrote a book, which I can highly recommend if you don't have it. This one.
Yeah, I have that.
Yeah, that's a very good study of what he calls the English ascetical theology according to the English pastoral tradition. Might be a bit dated here and there. And there's a wonderful 2-volume work. I have it over here someplace by Gordon Mersell.
Yeah, that's good.
That's an excellent resource as well. But Martin Thornton was able, I think, to he hones it down, and he shows you, for example, how the Book of Common Prayer picks up on sort of this Benedictine, scholastic, but not aridly scholastic. So the idea of reason playing a large part there in that tradition, and showing how it really shapes the English spiritual tradition that still you can pick up Walter Hilton, 14th century. You can pick up a writer of the 17th century. Those are probably your two great periods of English spiritual tradition, the 14th medieval period, 14th century, and then your 1600s, the 17th century. And in that you would obviously include your metaphysical poets like Herbert and Donne and others. I was an English literature major. I took 2 majors, that and philosophy. So I was very much reading at the same time those English literary texts at the same time that I was studying Christianity and getting involved in the mystical tradition itself. So anyway, but I would say, yes, you can hear a distinctive voice, and the characteristics are, well, like the English character in general, somewhat shy of too much emotionalism. So you don't get, you just plain don't get the same kind of even John of the Cross and people like that I love, much more effusive. I mean, maybe the closest would be Thomas Traherne, but even he is restrained and focusing on the beauty of nature and things like this. And so even he doesn't become as extreme and say nuptial.
Yeah.
Sexual, erotic imagery in his mysticism as people on the continent tended to do. So anyway, I don't know if that answers anything.
That's very helpful. Now, what was really struck me is well, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing also put out a translation of the mystical theology of Dionysius.
Oh yeah.
And at the same time, now I don't know if you heard you bumped into this, but I bumped into it someplace. But those Cistercians were kind of like mysticism smugglers across the channel.
Oh, they definitely were. Yeah.
And one of the things that they did, I don't know if you heard this, but there's a translation into Middle English of Marguerite Poretta's The Mirror of Simple Souls that survived the dissolution of the monasteries, was not burned somehow. I don't know how it didn't happen, but it was rediscovered. And I have a copy of it that it was only ever put out in a scholarly version. It was actually part of a journal. They put it out as the one journal, and it was so even from the Vatican. It was so hard to find that I had to get the librarian at the college where I was working pay for it to be delivered. But you're right. I mean, there's something interesting here, and I think, and tell me if I'm right or wrong here. I think what happens is this is where, as Underhill was saying, that theology becomes poetry, or poetry becomes theology, because you mentioned the Book of Common Prayer. I mean, I don't think it's almost unequal as a beautifully poetic liturgical text.
It's one of the three great, what you call almost like the Great Code, to use Northrop Frye's term. One of the three great literary texts, as well as a religious text. I mean, you have Shakespeare is one corpus, the authorized version of the Bible, the King James Bible, and the Book of Common Prayer. Those three, if you have that, you have a code by which you can then open up subsequent English literature, and there's echoes of it even in detective novels. I mean, P.D. James with Devices and Desires, picking up a prayer of Cranmer just for the title of this mystery novel. And so you find, if you know these texts, then English literature becomes a lot less mysterious to you as to what it is they're referencing or what they're falling back on very often. There's others as well, Alice in Wonderland, for example.
Yeah.
But those three in particular. And but you're right. I think for the Anglican tradition and for the English tradition and English Catholic tradition, I mean, when you bring people in like Newman and others, you very definitely have a literary, I'm being besieged here by a black cat.
Foreboding. Huh?
I just, if you can kind of bring up whatever that symbolizes, just think about that for a while. But it's very much a literary tradition. So, without trying to sound snobbish, it's the aesthetics of English Christianity, and you'll find this is true at Westminster Cathedral, the Catholic cathedral, just as much as you'd find it over at Westminster Abbey. So, there is a love of aesthetics in a good sense, that beauty is important, whether it's visual, whether it's the very, very rich English choral tradition, which I think is virtually unequaled, at least in the West, by anybody, and the language. When even the updated language very often is still echoing back there its heritage. It still comes through in the updated texts that they use. So,
a practical question: since your blog, your Substack is called Practical Mysticism, and you guys, much more informed about the English mystical tradition. But if you're describing English mysticism as being kind of singular and unique in the fact that I might say for our listeners, it sounded like more austere. And when you compared it with the very sensual nature of John of the Cross's mysticism, if somebody today, to get into the practical, working with college students, we could sometimes, just looking at prayer, you can look at that Ignatian tradition, highly imaginative versus, I used to work at a Trappist monastery right down the road, centering prayer, that kind of more Trappist austere. Do you think any of this is tied, Addison, to the temperaments? Like if you were, if you saw somebody wanting to read into it or to immerse themselves, is this the temperamental thing that some people are just going to go towards the more sensual, or,
Yeah, I think it's cultural too. I mean, there's a reason why every culture has its own distinctives. I mean, there's very definitely a Greek kind of orthodoxy, which is Greek and not Russian. There's a very distinctive, and it's very hard sometimes to even identify what it is that you're seeing there. But I mean, Spanish Catholicism, Italian Catholicism, similar but not the same, and French again. Similar but not the same. And so you can go from place to place and see certain cultural distinctions. Temperament, maybe. I mean, but I would say now my own temperament, because if you would say, well, what's your Myers-Briggs? It's an INTJ. Okay. So anything that's too effusive is going to turn me off immediately. And if it's too extroverted, where I actually have to greet people in the next pew by hugging them, please. Thank God for the restrictions. You all may not like them, but believe me, there are psychological reasons that I appreciate them. But but all that aside, I think yes, there are those things that the personality that is going to make you gravitate to one form or another, and for me, I hate to say, I mean, it's terrible to say. I wouldn't know what I would do if I didn't have a beautiful liturgy to worship with on a Sunday. I would feel absolutely destitute. I mean, I might have to go through with it, but I would be hungry inside, for something more substantial. All that aside, you use the word austere, and that's where I would sort of differ. I wouldn't say that the English tradition is austere, because I think what you find is a great deal of warmth. I mean, certainly when you're looking at someone like George Herbert, or Isaac Walton, for example. I mean, writing a whole book, The Complete Angler, where he's slipping in this kind of contemplative aspect to a book about going fishing, basically, and not talking about the English Civil War, which is what's tearing his world apart at that point in history. But here he is talking about something which is consoling, pastoral. That's a big word in the English tradition. You'll find that's true in Walter Hilton. I mean, when you think about Richard Raleigh, even though he's an emotional sort right there.
Yes, he is.
but fun, and but these are people. But with Hilton and probably with the author of The Cloud, you probably have Augustinian canons who are writing this.
Okay.
And they are primarily interested in pastoral matters. So when they're talking about how do you contemplate, how do you pray, they're thinking about not only the religious people that they're writing to, but also how does the person in the pew respond to this. And even someone like Julian of Norwich, who's there's emotion there, there's warmth there. What a beautifully well thought through theology. And when someone like a Marjorie Kemp, and talk about another very emotional type,
Very, 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 very emotional.
but she goes and talks, at least it seems to be that it's Dame Julian that she went and consulted, and what she received from her and from others as well, all through her very stormy life, was passed. And so that's actually very central to the English tradition. It's in that sense they're very Augustinian. We don't stay up here on this level. We're not in the dry arid thing. We're not simply down here with the emotional. It's how do we bring head and heart together, which is an Augustinian way of thinking. And we can criticize Augustine for a lot of things, but not for that. His pastoral sensibilities were keen and sharp. And so when you're reading Augustine, what do you get? Well, you get this beautiful blend of a deep emotion, a deep, rich passion within him, mixed with an incredible intellect that seems to go together naturally. And that's something that got injected into the English form of spirituality quite early, and I would argue has lasted throughout the centuries.
Yeah. Just this morning I was thinking Augustine, I was thinking about him, but just the whole everything we say about him, like if people are, sometimes I can get down on the guy, but the two things that jump out to make you see, like, you got to stay with this guy is love God and do what you want. And then the other one, that which is called the Christian religion existed among the ancients and never did not exist from the beginning of the human race until Christ came in the flesh, at which time the true religion, which already existed, began to be called Christianity. He's opening doors, even at times where I think he's kind of shutting down things. He's opening doors at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you just said there, Addison, I think is important, is this emphasis on the pastoral. And I think, in fact, right in here,
yes.
never more than a couple of feet away from me is Robert Herrick.
Robert Herrick. Oh, yeah.
Who is, he's my ideal pastor. I want to go to his church. But also in the pastoral tradition that you're talking about, which touches on every aspect of this kind of Anglican spirituality that you see in the hymn book, especially the one put together by Ralph Vaughan Williams, who is one of the more sophisticated composers of the 20th century, who was deeply rooted in those folk traditions and made those songs so singable, and made sure that the Oxford Book of Carols, for instance, is full of singable tunes.
Yeah.
Right.
Ralph Vaughan Williams was well, he's up there at least in my top 5 favorite composers for those very reasons. Also, if you can, I don't know if you have a copy, you might, but but in America, the 1940 Episcopal hymnal,
I got it,
is a superb collection of hymns. I don't know. Ralph Vaughan Williams and and you have maybe, I think, the 2 best in the English language.
In fact, we adapt a lot of those for folk instruments when we do house church. So
can I take a question and maybe this will be a little bit sideways, and then we'll rejoin the mainstream, but our listeners and myself too, you guys know the English tradition so well. We've named the beauty of the Book of Common Prayer, the King James Bible. We've named the beauty of some of the cathedrals. We've talked about this great history with the mystics and so forth, and how pastoral it could be. Maybe the microcosm within the macrocosm. Addison, Mike, we entitled this podcast the Regeneration Podcast. So implied in that is that, like, there's something that needs a lot of regenerating. Do you have a little 2-minute soapbox, like what's going on with English Christianity or something? When we have these from which we came, the treasures from which we came. I know that's a huge thing, but I was just overwhelmed with what you guys were saying.
Yeah. Well, it's still there. I mean, it's the situation in all of these nations. Europe is maybe worse even than the United States. I mean, the Episcopal Church committed suicide is what it did. Just
Say more. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to go too much into that, but it basically by siding with just one, well, politics is always the death of a church. It doesn't matter if it's extreme right or extreme left. If the minute you put politics at the center of a church's existence, and you're putting in that, which is to divide, and it doesn't really belong there. Yes, you have to have certain ethical and moral standards by which you make political decisions, and church is a great place to get that ethical and moral formation. But what you don't want is to have divisive politics from either direction. Well, the Episcopal Church, beginning 50 years ago, decided to move steadily in one direction, and the result has been disastrous. Now, many people in that church will tell you otherwise. You know, they're holding for social justice reasons or whatever. They have this. But the truth is that their church is shrinking, and they have reached a point now where it's an open question what it is even to be an Episcopalian in the United States. The Church of England is suffering from some of that itself. Right now, it's going through a very bad situation of the same old conflict that's been afflicting the church for 50 years is the argument over sexuality. And the problem, of course, is making sexuality of such supreme importance that it becomes the barometer as to whether or not you should be included in the church's life or not. And so this has become hugely divisive. So then what happens to your tradition as a result? You have this rich tradition. It's still, I mean, there are great priests I know in England, great priests in the United States, in fact. But they're struggling because it's a tradition that's in constant turmoil. Roman Catholicism, as you know, is having its own problems with polarization along some similar lines. So what do I feel about? And again, it boils down to feelings, not to because I certainly don't look ahead with any sense of having prescience or able to prognosticate what's going to come. But I wrote a book some years ago called Strangers and Pilgrims Once More. And it's a theme now that everyone talks about. It's how are you Christian after Christendom? Because Christendom, a church life that's upheld by the society and by the political system and all outside, that doesn't exist in the West any longer. That's just not there. And I'm afraid we're seeing the consequences of what happens. Now, it has both a positive side and a negative side. The positive side is perhaps what you all have experienced by bringing some of that liveliness into, say, a home situation, or more into a living community situation. So you're able to carry on the traditions regardless of what the church down on the corner is doing. Mm-hmm. But I think the reality is that as time goes on, we're going to see the tradition being held onto by a hardcore core of people who really care about it and preserve it and do it in a living and loving way, and that's where we're headed. I'm not sure about the survival of the institutions per se. Mm-hmm. I really don't know if that's even realistic to think that in another 50 years something incredible could happen. But I have a horrible feeling that you'll visit, say, Ely Cathedral in the United Kingdom and and this magnificent place, and it's more a museum than it is.
Sure. Or a Starbucks.
Or a Starbucks.
A lot of churches in London, right?
Same could be true of the Vatican too. Absolutely true.
Yeah. So So that's my Jeremiad right
Oh,
there.
thanks for doing that. I thought it was inappropriate. I knew I was interested at that point because you had talked about this wonderful sap coming up, in this beautiful tree. And then
Yeah.
I was just sitting here like, I felt like an outsider because I'm usually in your roles,
Yeah.
kind of explaining to people outside the church, why are we in such a sad state? So it was on my heart to say, how did this all come to naught? Yeah.
Well, I think Huxley was onto something when he had one of his characters in Brave New World called the Arch Community Songster, who's supposed to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. um, and that's been one of my sad things to watch the Anglican Church, because I just tell people, after having immersed myself in this spirituality for so many decades, I'm basically 49% Anglican. But it's hard to watch a lot of what unfolds. In fact, you probably know this author, and I don't like his theology at all. Don Cupid, you know him?
I do.
Oh yeah, I do. I mean, I don't know him, but I know his.
But he wrote this book on mysticism, which I didn't love, but I think he made a good point that now he thought mysticism was only a rhetorical mode, which is where I think is wrong. But I think he's right in that it is a rhetorical mode, right? There is a way to write mysticism, or ways to write mysticism, which is interesting. But he didn't actually believe in God, and he was an Anglican priest, So okay, can we start over? But what I'd like to go from there, though, is to something both of us love. Now, as we all know, this week was the week of this.
Oh yeah, St. Bridget.
Saint
Bridget's cross.
Yeah.
So these folk traditions that we both love and revere to a degree, where's the role of that, do you think, in the future of a Christianity?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting. I don't do by any chance, do you have this book on your shelf, The English Year?
I have it.
Yeah, very nice book. Very good. I enjoy just picking around. It's like an almanac almost.
Mm-hmm.
You can just kind of pick around and find good stuff in there. One of the things he points out in his introduction there, which I just happened to pick up and look at yesterday, was that all of these folkways that we obviously, you can trace some of the roots back to pre-Christian paganism, but he completely blows out of the water this idea that all these folkways that we love, that are spiritual and communal and fun and all of these sorts of things, the idea that all of those are just sort of baptized paganism. And he makes a very good statement in there that for a scholar like himself, you can't find that as it developed before the advent of Christianity in Britain. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that these folkways, these customs, these things that obviously are still living in the minds of some, or we wouldn't have books like this book by Steve Rout that it just held up. Those things still have an appeal, and people are still drawn to them, usually for the wrong reasons, because they're going there because they can't find it in their churches. They can't find the sorts of fellowship and congeniality and good cider, things like that. They can't find that in their own institutional contexts, but they long for that. And when we begin to understand that in many ways, these folkways are profoundly Christian. They were based on a calendar. They tie nature together with God, with Christ, with community. They celebrate the good things of life, the good things of earth, and that these things are, in a sense, you can get all theological and say, well, they're all incarnational and use big words like that. But the truth is much more basic than that, that they are essentially a Christian form of of living a communal human existence that celebrates creation in a beautiful way, and redemption as well, and the saints. And I assume you all got your throats blessed today.
I didn't, because I didn't get to mass. We had some of the schools were closed, and they closed the daily mass.
No, I couldn't get there myself, but little things like that. I mean, if you think about it, yesterday's Candlemas,
Today's Saint Blaise.
Today's Saint Blaise, and what do? Well, you take a couple of those candles and you make them into a cross and bless throats, and it looks like a completely nutty thing to do. And yet, what you're doing just by a gesture like that, a very good example of the sort of thing we're talking about. It's a folk custom that draws on the idea that here's a man back in the 300s in Armenia who was executed for his faith, and we're remembering him. And there's a legend about how he blessed a child's throat, and we all get coughing fits in February and in this kind of weather. So let's bless throats. And we have these candles, which we just celebrated because yesterday was this wonderful fire feast, which celebrates the Mother of God giving birth to new life in Christ, and was originally a pre-vernal celebration that spring is on the way, the season when Jesus is going to die and resurrect in the Christian term. So all this ties together, and people have a hunger for tying together their entire lives with something like the fabric of a spiritual tradition and a spiritual fellowship. So to get back to the original question, how do these things fit in? Well, who's going to do them if we don't? And who's going to make them tie into the Christian faith if we don't?
You said it all so perfectly. I'm not so sure, Addison, if I've heard it said more concisely. This is a good week to do it, right? Because we have Groundhog's Day. We have, the whole thing. There's a lot going on this whole week when we're so bored. But the other one is St. Blaise. I'm a Catholic. I'm a layperson who runs this Catholic parish. It was giving pre-service breakdowns. And, again, it's something lay people can give the throat blessing to other lay people. It could go out from the mass setting. And, on Ash Wednesday in a couple of weeks here, nobody's coming to church anymore, but I could walk through the State University in Geneseo, New York. I could go up to the library, and people are like, "Are you the church guy? Are you the church guy? Do you have ashes?" And I do say there, I do invite them up to the interfaith service or the ecumenical service or the mass. But you could, as we all know. And so,
and it's the thing is that so many, about a year ago, I don't know, maybe it was a year ago, I had a conversation with Jonathan Pajot on his channel, and he was talking about the glories of the coffee hour, and I remember kept telling him, that's not enough, man. That's not conviviality. And this, like Addison said, this has been my position. If those guys are doing this stuff, we are, right? Because I have 9 kids, and only one pastor we've ever had. Speaking of the Feast of the Purification, only one pastor we ever had actually churched my wife at 6.
Say more. A church. Okay, gotcha. Yep.
Have you ever seen it happen, Mike?
No.
Never.
No.
And this Byzantine Catholic priest said, we're going to church body this Sunday. So it's after 6 weeks because women would be in seclusion after the birth of the child. And their re-entrance, their reconsecration into the life of the church would happen then, and it was beautiful. It's very simple. It's
a beautiful idea. If you don't, there's going to be people who are going to object to just about anything like that, but the meaning of it is actually quite beautiful, quite affirming, and I agree with you. I think it's.
I've never seen it. That's the only time I've ever seen it in my many years in church.
That's really the refrain, what you guys were just talking about, myself included. I think, Michael, you would agree that that's the refrain here of the Regeneration podcast. It's going to be us. That if I started doing it, Michael, you live 6 hours away. I've got some influence here running the parish. We get these things going this week, and in midsummer for John the Baptist, hit those Michaelmas. Then all of a sudden I can picture them linking up, right? We get our things going, and all of a sudden your 12th night thing, we start sharing stories, or we can even take a trip to be with you. And it's all of a sudden, as they know, again, speaking of Candlemas, once it starts spreading, it can be quick, folks. You don't have to look, stay in the now. Don't worry about, this is not clock time. If it is conviviality, this thing can spread like wildfire.
Yeah, and like Addison said, people are hungering for this. They would love to have, and this is when I've written about this before. I think the attraction so many young people have had for neo-paganism, for instance, is basically what's sold as neo-paganism, and for the most part, is medieval and early modern Christianity, with all the festivals, and that's what people want, connection to the creation as well as to God.
I was taking a master's in theology up here in Rochester it was a closed seminary. And I was studying the liturgical year and so forth. And I think my mom threw in a movie. It was still a VCR, and it was the Milagro Beanfield Wars, which was, I think Paul Newman directed. No, Robert Redford. And it caught some of, Mexican, the border area, that type of festival Catholicism. And I was taking a course in the liturgical year and saw it there. And again, I just got so hungry for it, and at the same time too, the color, the true color of that, at the same time as the whole world was talking about diversity, you realize you take a color wheel and you spin it too fast, and the color you get is gray, right? Our friend Larry Chapp talks about beige Catholicism or something. Yeah. Diversity in one sense of the world, when you spin it too quick and it's not anchored to the church year, what we're all feeling now is it's just gray. It's just gray. But the liturgical year, and it's those contrasts, gray with the color, and then what I was studying in class versus what I saw in the Milagro Beanfield Wars, And I think just being hungry for something and naming what we want gives us the energy. We will find a way to pull it off, but we have to nurse that yearning for it like a bubble trying to reach the surface, and not wait for somebody else to do it. Certainly not the priests.
Yeah. Well, they come from a generation themselves that in a sense they do the best they can, but they really weren't trained. That's the sad reality, and you can't expect them to be enthusiastic about something they don't have a real sense for anymore. It's kind of out of their system. And let's face it, things in most parishes, and it doesn't matter if it's Catholic or Episcopal or Lutheran or whatever. Right. It's so bureaucratic and so committee oriented, and everybody has to have a say in the political aspect of the ecclesiastical politics, church life. That it's remarkable that in some cases it's not even more dead than it actually is. If there's a way to grind the life out of something, they have perfected it.
Michael and I were just, before you joined us, Addison, we were talking, and I hadn't heard this. Michael, share what you said about, I was mentioning committees, that work through consensus. There's ways other than hierarchy. I think Owen Barfield.
Consensus, yeah. It's not consensus. It's just talking. Who can talk the longest wins.
Yeah.
Die.
Yeah. And that's committee meetings and so forth.
Oh God, stop it.
Boy, do I know them well.
Yeah.
Addison,
yes.
your Substack, it's really great, and I've got to subscribe, but I wanted to read your incipit, your intro. So, you're making two distinctions between it's called Practical Mysticism, and you're talking about mysticism versus pragmatism, bringing in William James, and then you're unpacking it further, and you're talking, the second distinction was which again? I just finished it this morning. It was perennialism versus individualism. I invite people to your Substack. Yeah.
Yeah, individuation, not individual.
Individuation, Jungian individuation, right? Yeah, an important distinction there. Invite people to your Substack and let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Why did you name your Substack? What are you mining at now? In this format, a Substack. Why did you choose Practical Mysticism? I love it because again, mysticism. Yeah. If we took Karl Rahner's notion that the church will be mystical or it will be nothing. When I'm trying to unpack that for students, I'm saying the church will be I felt like I need to unpack it and say the church will be experiential or it'll be nothing. That mysticism is something else we can make a collector's hobby, but you calling it practical mysticism really helps, or pragmatic mysticism.
I call it pragmatic system because I gave 4 terms that I unpacked on the Substack, which to me are central to the Substack. Now, obviously, what I want to do is cover the mysticism of, as I did when I was teaching this way back in '82 at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, is talk about the traditions, the great traditions. So I want to give equal context to the mysticism of other faith traditions as well. But obviously, as a Christian myself, the main emphasis is Christianity. But the 4 areas that I specified as being of importance for my own understanding of the spiritual life were first, mysticism itself, which I defined as basically I'd have to go back and actually see what I wrote there, but mysticism itself is something. I mean, somebody used to. I remember hearing a priest joke about it. It begins in a mist and ends in schism.
That was a great line. I never heard that.
But here I was reading the great mystics at the time, and I thought, oh great, here's somebody who obviously doesn't know much about mysticism. But mysticism is basically a sense of that there is a deeper reality in life that can be tapped. I think it's a more robust word in some ways. It maybe doesn't sound robust to some, but to me it does, much more so than spirituality, because the word spirituality, unfortunately, has come to mean such a wide range of things that it's unclear what it actually means. Mysticism draws you in a bit. It's telling you there's a certain discipline in place here. It has a heritage. It goes back to certain people and places and customs and traditions which have developed over time and involve things like a serious commitment to things like meditation, to dealing with your inner life in a responsible and intelligent way. So mysticism has that going for it. The other word is pragmatism. And really, you can incorporate that into the mysticism thing, but pragmatism, and I mean that in the C.S. Peirce, William James sense that I hate to use the term, but I think it makes sense that when William James says it has to have, you have to show me its cash value. Good American, cash value makes a lot of sense there.
Mm-hmm. Show me the money.
But in other words, if it works, not if it is a great metaphysical, speculative theory or a concept out here, it has to come back down to earth. It's got to actually have a living, and again, experience. Which of you were talking about the experience a minute ago? It was. But that's really where pragmatism comes down. What is it that's working for you? Because there's different forms of mysticism. There's different approaches. There's different practices. And the question is, what is it that's going to open you up to this intuitional side of your faith that is real and connects with you on a deep level? That's what pragmatism is all about. And pragmatism does mean down to earth in a way. There's sort of the lazy man's definition, but it has to have, again, to use James's words, it has to have cash value. It can't just simply be up here. It's got to be with feet on the ground. The third word I used was individuation, and I took that directly from Carl Jung, and it's not individualism. Individualism is really almost the opposite. Individuation it's a beautiful concept, and I'm very fond of Jung. In fact, I had an interview yesterday with somebody on Zoom about Jung. It was just all about Jung. But and yeah, you can find problems here and there in Jung's thinking. You can with anybody. But that said, his understanding of individuation was that the self is not the same thing as the ego. Okay, the ego, which orders and makes conscious aspects of ourselves, is very important, but it's also a very small aspect of the self. And that the self includes our personal unconscious, which is vast, and undergirding that, the even vaster collective unconscious, which is our inheritance, is where all the myths and the dreams and all come from, that kind of bubbling up through our personal unconscious and plague us at night in our dreams and things like that. And for Jung, it's very important that you become a self, a fully realized self, as much as is possible. And that means making the unconscious conscious, so that you become aware of, say, your dream life. And we're maybe the first, when I say the first generation, I mean the first epoch, modern human beings, modern man, that doesn't take dreams seriously. You know, and we partially thank Freudian psychology for that. It's the dumping ground of our minds. Jung turns that around. This from ancient times. This is how we've understood God, nature, speaking to us, warning us, guiding us, directing us. How do we learn to pay attention to that? How do we get past the ego so that we're not putting on the persona, the social constructs, and getting stuck there? How do we get past our shadow, or embrace the shadow, understand that these are the neglected parts of ourselves that we don't want to face? And you can see how that actually works very well in a Christian understanding of spirituality, coming to terms with the fact that our ego is not the only thing going on. It's how do we make the unconscious conscious, and how do we let, in a Christian context, how do we let God speak to us from the deepest recesses of ourselves and become full selves? So that's individuation. And what Jung meant by that was individuality. How do we set ourselves apart from the herd and are seen as separate? Individuation is almost the reverse. There are divided aspects in our nature. They're divided, unconscious and conscious. So how do we break down those divisions and individuate, come and have an inner integrity? And once we do that, we actually find our commonality with other human beings. And my argument there is, along with Jung, is that if you want to know God, you come to know yourself. And the way you know yourself is you realize that it's bigger than the ego. Yourself is part of nature, and that nature lives, moves, and has its being in God. And that's precisely what Jung could say. I don't believe in a God. I know that God exists. Okay. So now we can argue about what kind of God he's talking about, but basically Christians and Carl can agree on that. And then the last of the four was perennialism. And by that, I wanted to be very careful with what kind of perennialism I mean, because there's different kinds. And the kind of perennialism I'm talking about is the fact that between the various faith traditions, and it's the most basic and most simple, it's what Aldous Huxley would have said. We see, for example, that there are common, there's a lot of differences, but there's a common tradition that we can recognize that is interpreted through these various faith traditions. So that this is why contemplatives, East and West, Buddhism and Christianity disagree entirely about the nature of ultimate reality. But when it comes to meditating and coming into contact with that reality, they can agree. And it's an amazing thing to watch, that with contemplatives coming to the heart of the matter, they can do that very quickly and do it together, and have done it for years now,
Absolutely.
from time of Thomas Merton to now, and probably before that. And it gets back to the Augustine quote that you did early from his Retractions, that the that the great religion that pre-existed Christianity, named as Christianity, was what we call Christianity today. That tradition exists in various forms, because God, the Word, the Logos, is present everywhere, and maybe is understood or perceived differently, or defined differently, or conceptualized, systematized, whatever, differently, but that we can still find that common spiritual core in all of these faiths. And that's what I mean by perennialism, not to get into the,
Right.
I don't want to get into the Schuon and all of those
Right.
characters.
But I think that's also what that kind of perennialism was being espoused by in the Florentine Renaissance by Pico della Mirandola.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And I always think, wow, this was happening just before the Reformation blew everything up. Because when the Reformation hit, then it became politics again. And here they were on the cusp of this really fascinating moment in Christian history that never quite realized itself, even though it didn't ever go entirely away.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. It really does have origins in the Renaissance period, and you see this popping up. You'll find Thomas Brown speaking like
Absolutely.
this, for example.
I think of young people too. A big thing for me, and it's probably only for me, but I've seen it in Illich, who said the Beatitudes. That things have come to such a pass that we can almost perceive them now. They're empiric, like blessed are the poor. And this Gerald Hurd, who is friends with Hodges Huxley, said the esoteric has become exoteric and the exoteric has become esoteric. The way I've been playing that out for young people in my mind now, they're kind of center of my concern with campus ministry, is that we have young guys, and I think I've said this before, they're collecting all this esoteric stuff. They're listening to Peterson and others, Peugeot, and saying, the tree here is the tree there and so forth. But they're having really a tough time making friends. And in this thing, I mentioned that Ivan Illich also said that prophecy has been supplanted by friendship in our time, that discipline. Ask any, I think, mystic on their deathbed, like, what was your great secret? They'd probably whisper, like, I'm thinking of somebody now who's somebody I look up to, friends. That being said, the term mysticism, I think we can get a lot of young people kind of lost in the water. And, your Substack is excellent, but I'm thinking of a time a couple of years ago, we were invited to go to Shin Yun, which was a program from the Falun Gong, was traveling around, beautiful dancing and so forth. But in that discipline of the Falun Gong, and I don't know too much about it, but they called it, this title from the East, a cultivation practice, that these people had a cultivation practice. And I kind of liked that, because mysticism can just be another collector's hobby for people. And what I like about what you're doing, Addison, is you're embedding that, and you're not allowing mysticism to hang out there. You're really embedding that with, practical, pragmatic, and the two aspects and so forth. But I'll just kind of offer for people too, this notion that, what we're searching for is a cultivation practice that can make us become more ourselves, and probably by doing so, give us that real aptitude for friendship at this time, which is so needed with this crisis epidemic of loneliness and so forth. Just a little bit of soapbox for me, I suppose.
No, I agree.
Inspired by your writings. Yep.
Yeah. If they're inspired by my writings, that's great.
Well, if you had your Substack and it was just mysticism, I'd think, oh, you're brilliant. I'd say, who is this going to help with that title? But the fact that you're giving it this kind of complementarity, and unpacking it makes it. And again, like, we need experiential religion, or we're going to die. This kind of just religion is the disease that Jesus came to cure in what's come of what takes place in our church right now, right? Just kind of lachrymose piety to try to have some magic affected that we get to a place called heaven. I don't know. I don't get it.
Yeah. And we don't want to go in the other direction where it becomes so cerebral and airy-fairy that people can't really identify with that, so you're right.
Even worse.
And I think
something that's real.
If it's not, it's, I think, important insight of my life is if it's not if your spirituality is not connected to creation as well as God, you're missing something. You're doing something wrong. And that's one of the lessons. That's what I think, moves me so much about your work and your sense of humor and the things you're interested in. I mean, I feel such a resonance with all that you do, and that's why we're so happy to have you come on the show today.
Yeah. Same with the stuff I see. Actually, I see Michael, and I don't see. Are you on Facebook, Mike?
I am. I've normally used it for campus ministry. My profile picture is the first day a student said I had to be on Facebook. I went to this copier, which is right behind me, threw my face down on the side, hit it, and that's my profile picture.
That's my driver's license.
I'll look for you because I should.
Yeah.
I should be.
I'll find you, Addison. Yeah, momentarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
I enjoy Michael's stuff and reading his blogs. Michael, your stuff's always interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah, I do a lot of writing for Front Porch Republic, this localist Wendell Berry inspired thing here. And,
okay, right.
Yeah, and I write for Michael's journal. I think every issue but one. Yep.
I probably read it and didn't even connect it, but great. Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
Well, this is wonderful. We'll have to have you on again, Addison. And again, let me say that you're speaking to us from Norway. And before we signed on, Michael asked you. Well, there's no joke. We'll end with this. A guy used to come to the college mass here, an old guy, and he would ask the students, because he would always wear suspenders. Why do I wear suspenders? And the students would say, I don't know. You got to keep my pants up. And then he'd ask the students, why do firemen wear red suspenders? And then to keep their pants up. Nonetheless, that echoed in my brain when Michael asked you, what took you to Norway where you are now? And you said, I married a Norwegian girl.
Yeah.
Pretty simple. We thought there was going to be a great mystical answer that you felt summoned to
It's pragmatic.
the world tree. Yeah. Pragmatic. Well, thank you, Addison. And I want to thank all of our listeners for listening to the Regeneration podcast. And can you any other directions to your Substack or anything else, Addison, at this time?
Just look up for Addison, Hodges, Hart, Substack, or Pragmatic Mystic Substack, and Google your way there, and you should find it very easily.
Great fun and great conversation. So we'll see everybody next week. Take care.